An important and often forgotten aspect that relates to writing about your life story is the collating of the stories. I often hear about adults who are going through their parents' stories and trying to sort them out, usually after their parents are no longer able to sort them for them, and it can become quite an emotional and overwhelming, to say nothing of being a confusing task, especially if there are a lot of stories to sort through. So therefore, I wanted to suggest a way of collating them and organising them as you go, rather than writing them all and going, yay, I finished, and then having to go through hundreds of stories and get them into the right order. So here is my theory, and please bear in mind, I am suggesting this for somebody who is writing their life story purely for themselves or their family, not for publication, and essentially for a collection of stories, so that if somebody wants to read specifically about the day they were married, the day they got their first puppy, the day they travelled abroad and emigrated, so that they know exactly where to find them, rather than having to sift through hundreds of pages or files trying to find the right one. So there are a variety of ways that you can divide your stories up. Obviously, chronological works really well. Unless, of course, you can't remember which years things happened in. Yes, there are the obvious ones, the birthdays, the big holidays, the moving, perhaps the new jobs. But if you're also covering smaller events, sometimes it can be trickier to remember which year it was, in which case chronological does not work quite as well, unless the divisions are a bit blurry, so that it doesn't matter if a story that actually happened in 1961 went into your collection of stories from 1950 to 1960. Perhaps better that in some respects than dividing it up into other sections which have less meaning to you. Another way that you can divide them is to put them, I've seen them divided into when people lived in different houses. So if they moved around a lot, they can say, this is when I lived in this town, and this is when I lived in this town, and this is when I lived in this town, which in many respects makes the chronological thing a bit easier, because we can normally remember which house we were living in when something happened, whereas we might not remember the year. Other things, I mean, if you've been married several times, maybe you could do it by husbands or wives. Maybe you could do it by jobs. Maybe you could do it whilst I lived at home, after I moved at home, whilst I lived in this country before I emigrated to this country. It really doesn't matter, but what I'm saying is, if you can divide your stories up into headings and categories, then it will make the organising and collating of them easier. So that would be my first tip. My second one would be, if you are writing on the computer and you are typing all your stories into the computer, to when you start out, open up a file that is labelled something like My Life Stories. Then, when you have that file, put into that a selection of other files for the years, for this 10 years, so that you've got 1999, 1920, no, that's not right, 1999, 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2010, 2010 to 2020. Then each time you've written your story, you can just put it straight into the right file. Because quite often when it comes to writing about our lives, we don't sequence the stories that we're writing. One day we might be writing about the day we were born, another day we might be writing about the day we graduated. And that's half the fun of it, really, because you write what inspires you at that time that you sit down to write. You don't want to have to be confined to years unless that's how you choose to write it. Everybody to their own. but I found a lot of people find that kind of structure a bit tight. They would rather write about something that's been inspired by a photo that they've just seen, or a conversation they had, or a memory that came to them. And if you're like that, I recommend that you have those files ready to go on your computer, and you can, when you've finished writing your story, you can just slot it straight into the file. Of course, never forget to back up those memories. Never forget to resave that major file, that one listed My Life Story, onto a thumb drive, onto cloud, wherever, so that you have it somewhere else, just in case something happens and something goes awry and they all get wiped, which I have to admit is a terrible fear, and I hope never happens to anybody, but it is a possibility. So if you are writing your stories on the computer, that's one way to do it. You may also want to print off your stories so that you have them in paper form. Now, if you choose to do that, I would recommend that you again put them in an order that works for you, rather than the order that they're written. And if you're going to put them in binders, I would recommend using a ring binder, because you can open it up at the right section of your life and just slot the pages in. If you were to have a different kind of binder, the ones with the plastic sleeves, if you wanted to keep them chronologically, you would have to then say, oh, but this goes after this one and before this one. So now I'll have to, if I put that in there, I'll have to move all these stories further through the book. And you'll have to reorganize your stories every time you add a new one to them, which is not ideal and perhaps a little frustrating and tiring and all those things that go with it. So for that reason, I would strongly recommend a ring binder that can be opened at any page. Or if you have a filing cabinet or a box of files, you can always have a folder for each decade and just slot it straight into there. If, on the other hand, you're choosing to write your story by hand in a journal or in a notebook, it's not quite so easy to divide up your stories, because they're not saved files and can't be reorganized as well, as you would probably have guessed. So in that case, my recommendation would be that you number and date each story that you write, each journal entry, and then on a separate piece of paper or a few pieces of paper, list the number, the date, and the topic of your story. You may even choose to divide up the extra pages that you're writing up into decades, so that you have one piece of paper on which you will write all your stories that relate to 1990 to 2000. You might have another page where you're going to list all the stories that happened between you can tell I'm a word person, not a number person, can't you? That happened between 2000 and 2010. You might have a third piece for when you write for all the stories that you've written for between 2010 and 2020, so that the sorting is less. People know where to find the stories that they're looking for. And if you've written in a selection of books, you might find it wise to also list which book the story is written in. Whether you number all your books, or whether you're going to say it's the brown leather one or the pink flowery one, just so that if somebody is going through your story, they can collate them easily, because they know what they're looking for and it's already started. And whilst it might be a bit time consuming when you do it as you're writing, I can guarantee it will be a lot easier to do then than when somebody is looking at your writing and they don't know what you've written, and they've got 50, 60, 100 stories in front of them, and they have to get them in order. Can you imagine that many pieces of paper across the floor as somebody's trying to get, this one goes after this one but before this one, and this one goes after that one but not before that one? I mean, let's face it, it would be an extremely challenging project for the writer, let alone somebody else who might know some of the stories and might get distracted whilst reading them but who doesn't know the order and has to start from scratch. So there you go. That is my suggestion. Always decide on the categories that you want to put them in, whether it's going to be decades, whether it's going to be relating to siblings, whether it's going to be around birthdays, whether it's going to be around husbands or wives, whether it's going to be around where you lived, the countries you lived in, the jobs you had, the pets you had. So many options. Just pick one basically and stick with it. And future generations will be extremely grateful to you for it. So there you go. I hope that gives you something to think about. As always, if you need some writing prompts to get you writing, please don't forget that every week on my YouTube channel I do post prompts to help you write about your life. I also have an extensive selection of packs of writing prompts on my Etsy store, the Writing Store. I will leave a link to that below. And as always, if you'd like more help with your writing, there's always my online writing courses on Skillshare, and the link below will actually get you those for free. So even more things to think about. And as always, have fun with your writing, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.